So here we are back at the ironing board, and I've since stitched lots and lots of bits of the binding fabric together, so you'll see in a minute that it isn't just these two fabrics that I started with, this orange and this yellow. There'll be some other colours as well, but this is the stitch that we did earlier. So there's the running stitch that we did, there's it pulled apart, so you've got your binding tape. So I mentioned before that we would iron these, we would split the seam to iron them, and you only do that really here in quilting, and you do it so that you don't end up with lots of bulky sections in your binding as you go through. So if I use the iron, this is why it's good as well not to have steam on, because this is where you'll definitely burn yourself. You open up your seam, so you split it in the middle like that. I hope that you can see that without the light. So you split the seam in the middle. So rather than ironing the seam to one side, either that side or that side like you did with your squares, this time you're going to split the seam in the middle. And once you've split that seam, here we go, you're then going to take the iron and you're going to iron the seam open. Normally I would use the iron edge to just get right in to push it open. It's a bit hard with where the camera's positioned, but so you iron over the seam so that you've got one bit of the seam going back over onto itself and the other going the other way. Then you'll go turn your fabric over as you did with your squares, and you'll use your iron and iron over to make sure it's as flat as possible. So you'll do that with every single seam on your binding as you go, and I'm going to do all of that in a moment, and I'll film it so that you can see it. Once you've ironed all of your split seams, you then need to start to fold over your edges. So if I pick up my bought binding that I showed you earlier, what you have is one strip of fabric that's then been folded over at either edge, so that it's got folds on either side and then a gap in between, and that gap in between is to help you when you fold it over your quilt, so you'll need to leave a little gap there. So we're going to do the same thing with the fabric that we've just done, and I've moved the camera around a bit just so that you can hopefully see in the light. So what you do is you take the edge of your fabric and you fold it over, and I would say it's about 1 centimetre. I like to do this by eye, it's the easiest way, and then you take your iron and you iron along that line to make that edge as crisp as possible. And then you take your other edge, you fold that over too. Again, on this one it's about 1 centimetre or so, and you take your iron and just iron along the strip. And again, a bit like with the sewing that we did earlier in ironing, you want to get it as flat as possible. Once you've done that with your whole strip, it takes a bit of time. It's quite a mindful task. It takes a long time to get all the way down your binding, but it'll be really worth it when you're finished. And when you've done your whole strip, you then turn it over and give it one final press on the right side with the iron, and that's just to make sure that those folds on either side are completely in place. Once you've made your binding, I've got some binding here that I made before. Once you have your binding and it's all together, you don't have to have binding that's all the same colour, as you can see, and you'll be able to then just roll it all together. It's best to roll it up in one ball. That's the easiest way to then attach it to your quilt, which I'll show you in the next tutorial. So if you roll it up as tightly as you possibly can, if you've got a safety pin or something to pin it, great. If not, just a way of kind of making sure that it doesn't unravel, so that when you're binding it when you're sewing it onto your quilt, you can roll it out as you do it across the line. And once you've done that with your binding, that's it, completely finished.